Здравствуйте, соратники! It's me, Akita Tail. I'm back and better than ever. This is my new filming location. I definitely chose this. This isn't my only choice. I have many choices in life. Why am I here? What do I want? What kind of world am I trying to help create? I'm here to talk about the 2020 documentary directed by Sam Feder and executive produced by Laverne Cox. 2020's Disclosure, Trans Lives on Screen. Within, we're shown the evolution of trans representation in mass media, starting with the very roots of filmmaking history, leading up to where we are today in 2020. Okay, so as a film critic, where do I get off talking about documentaries? First of all, I took a whole semester studying documentary in the University of Connecticut, so I think I know what the hell I'm talking about. Just kidding, but yo, shout out to Gregory Semenza, taught one of the best English classes that I took in my undergrad. Yeah, just don't use that one. Just cut that one out. Look, documentaries and fiction films are just different beasts. Sure, they're both vying for your emotional investment, but documentaries set out to illuminate the real lived experiences of other people, cultures, and the marvels of the natural world. They generally want to do more than tell a compelling story. By now you're probably wondering how Disclosure sets itself apart. Most other documentaries follow specific characters and stories as they explore their narrative spines, essentially their stories and their themes, but there is a huge amount of variety under the heading of documentary. These are called different documentary film models. Let's talk about a popular documentary for reference. Tiger King, the docuseries which came out earlier this year, is what we call an investigative documentary, in that it assembles evidence, builds a case, and presents a perspective on the facts. Disclosure, in contrast, can be called an advocacy or historical documentary, depending on the kind of argument you make. You can make a case for advocacy in that the documentary is trying to educate us on the importance of trans representation and agency in media. It's trying to have us change our point of view. At the same time, it accomplishes that with a thorough, historical review of how trans people have been represented in film and television, mostly to their detriment. If you only take away one thing from this video about how we as audiences should be watching documentary film, it's this. Keep in mind that the documentarian and their crew are trying to make an argument. Look at how they're using points and evidence to advance their point. That's why you can't review documentaries and films the same way. You have to dissect the documentary a little bit like an argument. You have to find out what makes it tick, what about it makes your feelings come alive, if they do, and the pros and cons in making whatever decisions they did to build that argument. In fact, this does something to the immersion. When you understand that a documentary is trying to open a dialogue between creator and viewer, instead of just providing another escapist option like some fiction films are, it changes how you view the piece. Disclosure's main argument is that trans people's representations in media influence how wider society treats them. More like cis-society, am I right? The problems with media portrayals of trans characters are actually approached with an aim to educate instead of to erase. It's the difference between Disney pretending that Song of the South never existed and Warner Brothers putting a disclaimer before their racially insensitive cartoons.
What trans people really need, though, is a sense of a broader history of that representation, so that they can kind of find themselves in it.
Every stepping stone to where we are today is foundational in understanding the bright and shining moment we're at in trans representation. And the documentarians actually acknowledge this up front. It's one of the first few lines.
I never thought I'd live in a world where trans people would be celebrated.
We have so much more representation in government, in media.
We are everywhere.
The GLAAD study referenced in the documentary states that 82% of Americans didn't know a trans person in real life before 2008. Because of this, people are left with only the limited and often disparaging depictions of trans people that Hollywood has. The documentary spends a long time talking about the various transformations that trans characters have gone through and their role in films, from the butts of jokes, to serial killers, to psychopaths, to villains and liars. What makes all of these examples, listed one after the other in a ghoulish procession, hit so hard is the impact that it's had on the many trans folks that are interviewed during this documentary, and the intercuts of these folks talking about growing up with these pieces of media as their only representations of people like them. You can see on their faces the impact of these alienating experiences.
I was about to go through transition, and I worked up the courage to tell one of my colleagues, and she's a very, very smart woman, very, very talented musician, very well educated, very worldly. And she looked at me and she goes, "You mean like Buffalo Bill?" Like her only point of reference was this disgusting, psychotic serial killer. It hurts. It just hurts.
This isn't a one-off either. The mountain of evidence is enough to overwhelmingly state that trans people aren't just imagining things. But this darkness doesn't go on forever. There is this one brilliant moment of light, and it's the documentary Paris is Burning.
Oh my goodness. I'm getting warm and fuzzy all over again.
These are my sisters up here, but the struggle is real.
It's just there's so many iconic moments that allowed me to see myself.
That's not to say that Paris is Burning didn't have any flaws, and that's actually addressed in the documentary too.
The kids didn't get any recognition.
How do you explain how other people have then seen Paris is Burning as
Because
something
they're looking
good?
outside in, and Paris is Burning is like their motto or something. What does it mean to go into cultures that you don't exist in and tell those stories?
In terms of appropriating someone else's struggle so that you can make a documentary, Paris has that written all over it. But ultimately,
I can be critical of Paris is Burning, but I'm so happy Paris is Burning also exists.
to have, finally, true and authentic, positive and uplifting media that celebrates having community for yourself and people like you when there had never been anything like that before in media, the joy is real. And the pain is real. The most standout example, to me, of the power of positive representations of trans people was actress Jen Richards admitting that she'd never even considered the thought of her family celebrating her for who she really was.
I had to be okay with my mom saying, "I will never call you Jen because Jen murdered my son." And I have to make that okay. I have to understand their position and be okay with it. And when I saw that father go so much further than I thought was even possible, it hurt. I couldn't bear it, because then all of a sudden, all those people who couldn't accept me, when I knew it was possible to go beyond acceptance, no one's looked at me that way. How could I look at me that way?
Here, the documentary is making the case that media shows us the world that we can embrace and live in, and that world doesn't exist until we make it, even if it's through a screen. Why haven't we seen this kind of trans representation up to now? What's changed? I'll tell you. It's the creative agency of trans people taking control of their own stories. For the longest time, it was the cis filmmaking world telling everyone,
All our lives, we've always seen ourselves refracted through other people's prisms.
Yeah, right.
We've always heard people analyze us, describe what our feelings are, what our thoughts are.
all these negative representations and stigmas came about because cis people did not allow trans people to tell their own stories. That branches out to cis men winning awards for playing trans characters as well.
John Lithgow in The World According to Garth.
Cillian Murphy, Breakfast on Pluto.
Red name, the Danish girl.
Having cis men play trans women, in my mind, is a direct link to the violence against trans women. And the people who are playing trans women are the men that they know. This doesn't happen when a trans woman plays a trans woman.
So, are there weaknesses to Disclosure's approach? Well, I have some things to pick on, but I really wouldn't call them weaknesses. I'd more likely call them something like drawbacks. We never get the full story of anyone that's interviewed. We don't know their full careers, their most formative experiences, or what they've done as trans activists and talent. I would have loved to hear more about these people, as most of them are probably generally not well known to the general public. I would also like to say that the fellas from Fish Jelly are right about it not being the first place to go for cis people to understand the basics behind the lived experiences of being trans. But before you do ask any blush-worthy questions, ask yourself this first. Why do you want to know? Is it important? Can't you just give people basic respect first. If you want to watch some great trans content on YouTube, just check out Cat Black or ContraPoints. I've got my favorite videos of theirs linked in the description. I didn't know where to organically put this in my script, so here goes. You ever think about how every group of people that aren't cis white men has been maligned in some way in media and has had to claw and fight their way in for representation that's equitable? That's because, for a long, long time, the majority of mainstream media was crafted to mostly appeal to cis white guys. So, the struggle for respect and representation shouldn't feel too foreign to women like me, or East Asians, or anybody else from the LGBT community, and so many more. Before we wrap up, I do have just one question. Why is this documentary called Disclosure? Did you even hear Jen Richards talk about it? Here's her talking about the concept of disclosure.
It reinforces their assumption that there is a secret that is hidden and that I have a responsibility to tell others. And that presupposes that the other person might have some kind of issue or problem with what's to be disclosed.
Ultimately, this documentary helps us see why trans stories matter. They help trans people understand themselves and their desires to learn about their own community. And they're here to help the rest of us understand their struggles and come to terms with their humanity.
And so knowing that 26 trans people were murdered in the United States last year, almost all of them women of color, I thought it was important that we memorialize the people who we've learned so much from, the people who contributed so much to our movement.
The documentary also mentions material redistribution at the end, which is great because you can not just elevate part of the community and increase a class divide between people who should be expressing solidarity at all costs. Am I right? Oh, what's happening? Oh, it's leaving. Oh, this is goodbye.